I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us this morning. The 2Rivers Festival is a program of Wellington Water Watchers. It's based on the idea that we will protect what we love. And so every year we partner with other groups in the community to take us on adventures on, around, or about our two beautiful rivers here in Guelph. Many thanks to our advertisers and in particular to our festival sponsor, the Guelph Outdoor School, for making the festival possible. This event, Birding for Beginners, is presented by Matthew Isles for Yorklands Green Hub. Matthew came to Canada just over 10 years ago after working for a year in the upper foothills of the Amazon basin in Ecuador, having studied zoology and restoration ecology back in the UK where he grew up. It was in Ecuador, where he had gone to primarily study insects, that he really got into birds. This continued in Canada. Arriving in Ottawa at the beginning of winter, following 15 months in the tropics, wildlife seemed sparse, but the cardinals and blue jays were sufficiently bright. He volunteered at Long Point Bird Observatory a couple of years later and learned how to identify a lot of different species in both the hand and field. Since then, he has worked at 3 different bird observatories in Ontario, including the 3 years as assistant coordinator at Long Point, in addition to studying golden wing warblers on the Frontenac Arch, counting sandhill cranes on Manitoulin Island, catching long-tailed ducks in the frigid waters of Lake Ontario, and banding shorebirds in Ontario's northern remote James Bay. Despite all this travel, he does most of his birding on foot from his back door, trying to minimize his footprint, whilst helping folks to connect with the natural world outside their doorstep. Just want to let you know that we'll be recording this event to share on YouTube later. So if you don't feel comfortable with this, please turn off your cameras. And if you have any questions, please post them in the chat box. And now I will let Matthew carry on. Welcome, Matthew.
Okay, thanks, Beth. Appreciate the little introduction there. Yeah, good morning, folks. Glad to see so many people up bright and early and interested in joining us today. Yeah, it's a little unfortunate that we can't get out and actually have a walk in the sun this morning at the site, but that's the way things are in the world right now. But it seems like it's been a good opportunity for, well, lots of people to, from what I've been reading in the media and online and stuff, lots of people have had a bit more time to connect with nature in their backyard, to spend time bird watching. And yeah, even with recent events this week in the States, you know, making sure that our natural spaces are accessible to everybody, all people, seems like an important thing to talk about right now as well. So yeah, I'm just really happy to see so many people here and interested in this today. And so, oh, Beth, I'm just trying to do my screen share here, and it seems to, I might not need to be enabled for that. I've got a little presentation here that I want to run through with you all. Okay.
You should be able to share now, Matthew.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, I've done a number of workshops in the past to do with, you know, intro to birding or birding in your backyard or in our urban areas. So this kind of follows that pattern, but I've not done one online before. So bear with me. But yeah, what I want to run through today basically is, you know, give you all a bit of an idea of some of the tools that you would need if you are starting off and birding for the first time. things that you might want to invest in, some resources that are free. We're going to look at some online resources that can help get you started. And we're also going to look at some of the basics, of the things that you want to look at when you go out birding, or when you're just looking out your window at your bird feeders. Some of the key points that you want to look at with birds in order to get familiar with them, to help make identification a bit easier. And then finally, we might just run through a list of some of the main kind of family groups of birds that you may encounter here in the city or on the Yorklands site. And we might even, if we have time, run through a little checklist of some of the species that you might see. Some of you may have been able to download that already, hopefully. And yeah, and then hopefully at the end, we're also going to have a bit of time for some questions. So if anyone does have any questions, I think what we're going to do is that you can punch them into the little chat option, where you can type things in, and I think Beth and I will kind of go through them at the end and see what we can answer. Does that sound good, Beth? Okay.
Yeah,
so,
that's fine, Matthew.
Cool. Let's get going here. Just a bit of a disclaimer. Some of the photos here are my own. Others I've gathered from the internet, and I've got a little list of resources at the end. I'm no photographer by any means. Some of the pictures you might see come from some of my experiences of being able to catch birds in the hand through scientific research. Others are just things like where I've been kind of fiddling around. This was when I spent the winter in Arizona a couple of years. So this is not a hummingbird species you're going to see here. But it just goes to show how you can set up a camera and get a nice shot of a bird coming to your feeder. This blue jay is from here in Guelph. So yeah, why the fascination with birds? I mean, yeah, birds are everywhere, which is, I think, one of the best starting points to think about. Everywhere you go, like your backyard, when you're out in the street, when you go on vacation, like either here in the country or somewhere else, there's always birds around, and there's always different birds to what you're going to find in your backyard. And again, like the birds that are around, they change throughout the year as well. And I think that presents us with a really fascinating opportunity, particularly here in Southern Ontario. Looking at one of the points a bit further down the list here, migration. We're in a really spectacular location here among the Great Lakes to see a lot of birds pass through during spring and fall. Birds that overwinter down in South America, a lot of them, South and Central America. And a good number of them are going to the boreal forest, the largest continuous stretch of forest on Earth, which is pretty much all here in Canada. And so you get a lot of birds passing through the Great Lakes area. They get kind of funneled through Southern Ontario. And, you know, migration is a little bit more spectacular if you're on the lake, places like Point Pelee, Long Point, even Toronto, Hamilton. But even here in Guelph, along the rivers, in the cities, natural spaces, and even in your backyard, you can get a surprising number of migrants passing through. But just to back up a bit here, one of the real best things I think about getting into bird watching is that there are so many resources and such a wealth of community already available for you to tap into. I started off in my biology career studying insects, and the long and short story of it was, you know, the resources just weren't there for it to be really something that's tangible. You know, I mean, identifying beetles under a microscope is pretty awesome, but it's not the same as going out with your friends and seeing birds. And just, yeah, it's not the same. So, and we've long known as well that birds are excellent indicators of environmental health. You've probably heard the phrase, the canary in the coal mine. Sadly, yeah, the way the Earth is right now, like Mother Nature isn't too happy all the time, and the impact that we're having upon the Earth is becoming more and more apparent to us, and birds are providing some indication of that. Birds are also very vocal, you know, they sing, daily. They have a wealth of other language as well that they utilize, different calls, and some of them can really help us to kind of connect with nature in a wider sense through this bird language. Stuff like alarm calls can really give us a sense of when there's a predator around, maybe a hawk. So tapping into that is a real like next level thing, which can be really, you can get a lot out of it. And also being able to identify birds by song is a key thing as well. We're going to touch on that today a little bit. So yeah, nature connection. We're a lot, you know, people today, particularly young folks, do seem to be a bit disconnected from nature. And so birding can be an excellent gateway to kind of reestablishing that. And it's the ultimate form of mindfulness, really. You know, a lot of people spend time now doing yoga and meditating and stuff. And maybe not the yoga part, but you can certainly meditate on the trail, just spending some time alone with a bird, watching it, seeing what its behavior is doing. It doesn't have to be running around, ticking all these birds off the list. You know, you can take it quite slowly and, you know, have a real nice connection with some of these individual birds. There's also opportunities for people who are getting into birding. Once you get to know your most common species, you can contribute towards citizen science. You can help scientists monitor bird populations and, you know, get a sense of what's going on in the wider environment. And so, yeah, people often get into birding because they've had a moment or an experience with a mentor that's been really inspirational. And so you're probably wondering, why do I have all these pictures of parrots here on the screen? Well, this was one of my moments of inspiration. I've had a couple, but this was in Ecuador over 10 years ago. I went there primarily to study insects. But we'd gone on a little side trip further up the Yasuni River, which is one of the main the Napo River, which is one of the main tributaries of the Amazon. And we went up to Yasuni National Park and we visited this clay lake. And basically these parrots, or a huge range of different species of parrots, would come in throughout the morning. And you start off with 1 or 2 species, and then eventually there was up to like 4 or 5 species of parakeets, including these beautiful cobalt-winged parakeets. Again, the photos aren't great because I'm no photographer. And eventually, as you build towards the climax, and then eventually these scarlet macaws came down. There was just a pair of them, and they were really quite timid. And they were just kind of at the top of the lick, slowly moving down. And what the birds are doing here is they're extracting minerals from the clay to help with their digestion. And so the place is just full of parrots. It's spectacular. And suddenly everything goes quiet. You could hear a pin drop. And then this hawk swooped in out of nowhere. And it's like in front of a big glass area. There's like a hide constructed so people can watch the parrots coming in. Suddenly all the parrots just lift and are gone. And this hawk swoops in, sat on a perch, and I was like, okay, birding is pretty cool. You know, I'd grown up in the UK, and a lot of bird watchers were pretty kind of old fuddy-duddy types, and it wasn't particularly inspirational, but this was the moment that I was like, okay, yeah, birding is pretty cool. And so that was the day that I made my first ever bird list. So maybe you will have a moment, or have already had that moment of inspiration. You're like, okay, this is something I want to spend some more time doing. One other thing I want to look at just briefly here is why do we say birding? Why do people say birding rather than bird watching? Bird watching is a bit more of an old-fashioned term. It kind of alludes more to, yeah, maybe walking in pastoral areas and just like in your tweed jacket, viewing birds. But I think a lot of younger birders now are really engaging their ears more so in the process and engaging in community, engaging with online tools. And so birding is just like a word that kind of encompasses all those things in like a more holistic sense. And a wise mentor of mine once said to me that birding is not an activity, but a state of mind. So do what you want with that one, but I found that pretty amusing. So where to start? You're going to need some tools. And again, depending on how far you want to go with this, whether it's just looking at birds in your backyard or whether you want to be out every day doing, you know, big years, big days, life lists, all that stuff, you're going to need some tools. The most important one, I believe, when you're starting off anyway, is to have a notebook handy. And that way, if you don't yet have binoculars or a field guide, You can make some notes about what you're seeing, maybe make a bit of a list. You can check things on the internet, or you can check a book back at home. But having this out with you in the field, or when you're at the window looking at the feeders, can be really useful as a way to make some notes, make a field sketch of a bird that you don't recognize, point out the key features. It's going to help you to help you to notice things that you may not have noticed before about a particular bird. And it's a great jumping off point, particularly before you want to invest in some of these other tools. Next important, I would say a field guide is going to be pretty essential. And you can do backyard birding without a field guide, but it's going to be much more pleasant with one. We also have a lot of apps right now, and I'm going to talk about that a bit later. But this, I think, is the next step, having some kind of ID resource so you can figure out what it is you're seeing on your feeder or in your yard or along the river here in town. Yeah, you don't necessarily need binoculars to do that, but binoculars are the next step. And so we're going to talk a bit about things to consider if you want to purchase a pair of binoculars, and also some ways where you can borrow a pair and get a sense of some of the factors that you may want to consider before you make the investment. I'm not going to talk about these next two too much, but a camera can be very useful. Again, you can go birding with just a notebook and a camera, or just a field guide and a camera. A lot of folks don't even own binoculars and still can connect with birds a lot, and they use cameras to do this. They get a photo in the field, they'll identify it back at home. Yeah, that is a great way to do things.
Excuse me, Matthew, can I just interrupt you for 1 minute?
Yeah, certainly.
Sorry, I just see a message here that from someone saying that your voice is really low and she's having trouble hearing you.
Okay. Let me see. I don't know what too much else I can do about that apart from speaking louder, so I'll try and do that.
If you turn up your your volume on your own personal computer.
Yeah, and I think my mic is as high as it will go. So yeah,
Okay.
maybe I'll just try and speak a bit louder.
Okay, thank you.
Cool, thanks for that. So what else was I saying here? Bird feeders as well are an excellent way to get the birds to come to you, to your backyard. And I'm not really going to talk about that here, but there are some great resources out there to get information about how to start up a feeder setup. There's a great store here in town as well, Wild Birds Unlimited. They have a ton of resources there and can really help you out in terms of getting a feeder setup that's going to bring some birds really close to you and your family. And that's a great way to connect with these little creatures. So just looking here briefly at field guides, and I'm going to give you a brief history of field guides as well. This started with a guy called John James Audubon back in 1827, or between 1827 and 1838. He published The Birds of America, the first ever field guide. The original copy of this was huge, like physically massive, and every bird that he painted in meticulous detail, you can see this blue jay here, was kind of, well, he actually shot all his specimens. You know, we're talking 200 years ago, times were very different, and people didn't have cameras then, so they would have to shoot birds in order to document and study them. And that was just part of science. And so this fella documented and was the first person to paint every bird in North America. Which at the time was, you know, he probably just could have chatted to the indigenous folk, got a better sense of what was going on rather than shooting everything, but that's not what he did. But he did come up with this amazing document, which also includes several, I think 5 or 6 species which are now extinct, sadly. So it's also a fascinating historical document. Following that, a guy called Peterson in 1934 published the first modern field guide, and it was based on birds of eastern North America, and he utilized what was known as the Peterson identification system, where all the birds were painted in the same kind of format so you can make direct comparisons. This was really revolutionary at the time. 1934. No one had done anything quite as accessible as this before. Clear illustrations and arrows pointing to all the relevant field marks that you would want to look for. So that really revolutionized bringing bringing bird watching to the general public. And then fast forward a bit to the year 2000, and a guy called Sibley published his field guide, which is kind of the next level and possibly, yeah, I would say one of the best, and it's one of the most popular field guides available today. This is the Eastern version. So for the Peterson and the Sibley, they have a version which is for the whole continent, the whole of North America, and they also have these regional ones. So if you're mostly going to be in the East and you're not traveling a lot, you're staying in Guelph, maybe you go down to Florida once a year. Well, not right now, but in the future, you know, maybe that's the way to go, because this is going to fit in your backpack or in your pocket even much easier than one of the big books. So yeah, with field guides, there are a few things to consider. So we have painted field guides like these three, and we also have some field guides that are mostly made up of photographs. I'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah, pocket size versus coffee table might be some considerations. You know, if you're out in the field every day, pocket size book is great to take with you. But if you're going out with a camera or you're doing most of your birding through your window, then maybe you want something that's a bit bigger. Nicer drawings maybe, but it's not something you could take out into the field. And then you want to consider whether you want to get something regional or for the whole continent. In terms of a continental wide guide, the National Geographic Birds of North America is fantastic. It's now, I think it's 7th edition, but it provides really up-to-date range maps, excellent pictures. They're a bit more lifelike than in the Sibley. Sibley really reduces things so that clarity is like the most important thing, but you'll see more birds in the National Geographic in their natural habitat, which is pretty cool. And it also, there is an Eastern and a Western version, but the one that covers all of North America is not that much bigger than Sibley. So you can still toss it in your backpack, you can still take it with you on the field. So it's a great option. We do have some photographic field guide options. This one is the Stokes, which is one I quite enjoy. There's another one that's particularly popular by a guy called Ken Kaufman, but they use photographs. And so they'll try and arrange all the photographs so that the birds are in the same positions again, so you can make direct comparisons. But often photographic field guides, they provide a more accurate representation of what the birds look like. So there's benefits and drawbacks to that. You know, you're getting a real sense of what the bird is actually going to look like in the field, but you may not encapsulate all those field marks in 1 or 2 photos. So the drawings, they do oversimplify things, but it allows the artist to point out the key features in a really concise and clear way, which is great when you're starting out. Personally, and my recommendation is, if you're going to get into birds a lot, you or your family, you might want both. You might want a painted field guide and a photographic one. One other option for a photographic field guide, this is more of a coffee table thing, it's a bit bigger, is this Crossley ID guide, which came out, I think, in the last 10 years. But it's pretty revolutionary. It's a little bit strange when you first look at it, because you're like, wow, this is a lot of hawks in one photo. But what he's done is he superimposes all these photos onto a background. And so it creates these really unique images. They're a bit bizarre at first, but again, it provides lots of different options for actual physical representation of what these birds are going to look like in the field. So it's a pretty neat book, this Crossley. Let's see, one of the most important things that you're going to see in your field guide are range maps. So do not neglect them, spend some time with them, get to know them, particularly for your common birds, because you may see something in the field and you may think that you've seen a rusty blackbird, for example, here in Guelph, and then, sorry, a brewer's blackbird, and then you look at your range map for brewer's blackbird and you realize they're not really here in southern Ontario. Tiny bit up in the Bruce Peninsula breeding maybe, but if you saw it here back in May, it probably wasn't a brewer's blackbird, it was probably a rusty blackbird. And so these range maps can really help help you figure out what it is that you're likely to be seeing in the field. Usually they're divided by color, usually, but not always. You'll have a light blue for where they spend the winter, these species. Usually a pink or an orange or something for the breeding territory. And then they may have a yellow section for where you're likely to see them during migration. And then possibly, depending on species, a purple zone where they're gonna be present all year round, both winter and summer and migration. So that's a little quick look at some of the key points you want to think about with field guides and some of the most useful aspects that you're going to discover within them. But these days we don't just have field guides. We're blessed in that we have a range of options that we can use to identify birds. And one of the key ones now that a lot of folks are using are bird ID apps for smartphones. So there are disadvantages to going down this route. You know, you may upgrade your phone and then you have to download the app again or buy a new app. Some are free, some you do have to pay for, and they're usually about $20 to $30, so the same price as a pocket field guide. So that's something to consider. Sibley is available as an app and it's very good. One of the main advantages though of having an app over a book is that they often come with calls, songs, and vocalizations built into them. So that's super useful, again, if you're in the field and you hear something you don't recognize, but you have an inkling, okay, it's a sparrow. You can flip through the sparrows, you can play the songs, and you can be like, oh, okay, it's this field sparrow that's singing. Yeah, phones, you can drop them, they break, the battery dies. These are all limitations as to how functional a bird app can be in the field. Also data, some of them will use data actively, others not so much, and you can use them even if you're not connected to the internet. So there's a couple of, purchasable options like iBird, Sibley. There's another one here that's pretty good, that's free for download, the Audubon Field Bird Guide app. But possibly one of the most useful tools that you could put on your smartphone is the Merlin ID guide. And it's not just an ID guide, it's not just an app, it's also an identification tool. It's available from the Cornell Bird Lab. I'll have the link up here at the end. And what you'll do is you'll install this and you'll start it up and it'll ask for your location. And then it'll ask you what you see, and you'll punch in something like, what size of bird it was. Was it closer to a goose or a sparrow? It'll use like key things that are really familiar to you, so it shouldn't feel too alien. It'll ask what colors are on the bird, and there may be an option as well to put in a photo if you want. This is not actually something that I use much, but I hear a lot of people, particularly when they're starting off, find it very useful. So something you might want to look at. It is free, and it could be a good option, particularly when you're starting out, before you want to, again, invest in binoculars or invest in a field guide. So that's a great option. Binoculars, if you really want to get serious about birding, binoculars are pretty essential. You can do it without them if you have a camera or if you're just birding through your backyard window. But beyond that, if you really want to get serious, or not, if you just want it to be a fun recreational thing, binoculars are super useful. And there are some considerations. You probably want to get a pair that are going to be waterproof, and most of them these days are. But even if you're not going to be out in the rain a lot, just the waterproofing, it's going to keep dust out a lot better. It's going to keep humidity out. They're going to just last a lot longer. But I think most binoculars these days, once you're spending more than $100, are pretty waterproof. Weight is another consideration. You might think it's a great idea to get a huge, massive pair of binoculars so you can see all the birds, but then you've got to carry them around with you on your neck, and that weight is gonna add up. So that's definitely a consideration. Cost as well. What's your budget? You can spend anything from $200 to $2,000 on a pair of binoculars, or less. You may find something at a thrift store. They're pretty hard to come by at a thrift store, or on eBay, something like that, which might be something a bit cheaper. But typically, brand new, you're looking at for a decent pair that's going to last you a long while, at least $250 upwards. Once you get past like six or 700, the increased quality that you get with binoculars up to $1,000, it's good, but it's not necessarily worth it if this is just going to be a casual recreational thing for you. So something in the $500–600 range could still last you a lifetime and be totally worthwhile, but without absolutely breaking the bank. And warranty is another consideration. A lot of binoculars now come with warranties. There is a company that's pretty good called Vortex, where they have an unconditional warranty. So if you drop them, if you break them, even if you run them over, you can get them repaired or replaced. Actually, the company, their technical side of things are based out of here in Guelph. So if you go through Wild Birds Unlimited, they'll often set you up quite nicely with like with the warranty and the options to get them serviced, that kind of things. Yeah, you also have to consider the specifications. So again, looking at, weight and what you're going to get for your price. There's a lot of numbers on binoculars, and it can be a bit intimidating. Like, what do all these numbers mean? So initially, you're going to see something with an X next to it. The first number usually is you're going to see something like 8×42, for example, is the most common, and it's the most recommended. And so what that means is the 8 is the amount of magnification. If you're looking at a bird through these binoculars, it's going to appear 8 times the normal size to you. And then the next number is the objective lens. So not where you put your eyepiece, not where you put your eyes, sorry, this is the eyepiece lens, but the objective lens is at the other end, and it's the width of it. And so the idea is the wider the objective lens, the more light you will get through. And, that's going to create a clearer image, but it's going to be most useful around dawn and dusk when light is lower or in low light conditions. So there's a benefit to having something that's 42 inches or more. But 8×42 is usually a pretty solid bet. If you go up to a 10 times magnification, you might find you have issues keeping them steady. Or if you're looking in a tree, you might find it's just too much magnification. It's really hard to find that bird in the tree. But something like 8×42 is optimal for a lot of beginner birders who are just birding in the park, birding in the backyard. It would be a good option for you. Just a brief bit about binocular anatomy here. Maybe you already have a pair of binoculars, grandpa's old dusty pair that he handed down to you, but you don't really know how they work, or they never seem to be in focus. Well, they might just be misaligned, but they also might be just not calibrated to your face. Everyone's eyes are different, and so you have to adjust your binoculars to compensate for that. First of all, you have these eye cups. Okay. All binoculars these days have eye cups at the top, and if you're like me, you wear glasses, you're going to want them to be screwed down. Okay, they usually just twist up this motion. You're going to want them down to avoid tunnel vision. If you don't wear glasses, you want them pulled out. You're going to have a little ring just on the right eyepiece called the dioptera. And we'll talk about that in a little minute, but it's essentially to calibrate the binoculars. In case you have one eye that's stronger or weaker than the other, you can adjust for that. You also have on the hinge the ability to move the binoculars to fit your face. I've got a really tiny, weird face, so I have to have them really close together. Finally, you have the focus wheel, and this is then the main tool that you're going to be using with your binoculars. Pretty much whenever I'm looking at a bird, my finger is on this, and it's just tracking one way or the other very slowly, very slightly, just until that image is crystal clear, nice and crisp. And binoculars are tricky to use. It's not going to come overnight. It takes a bit of practice. Yeah, maybe you want to practice initially just looking at an object, looking at a branch on a tree, like seeing it with your naked eye, and then pulling the binoculars up to see how fast and how quickly you can target that item that you're trying to look at. Because it's one thing looking at a tree or a post or a feeder that's not moving, but it's another one that's another challenge entirely, trying to hone in on a warblers flitting around really fast in the tree canopy. Not easy. So practice makes perfect. So yeah, adjust them to fit your eyes and face. Adjust the barrels until you get a singular circular field. That's like what I said about adjusting, compensating for the size of your face or the distance between your eyes. This talks a bit more about the dioptera, which can be a bit of a tricky thing to figure out, but fiddle around with it. There's lots of resources online. I'm not going to go into it now either. And see how that works for you. And then the focus wheel, as I said, is pretty key. If you're curious about binoculars and you're not ready to take the financial plunge yet, unfortunately, this is probably not an option right now with the current pandemic situation, but soon, hopefully, this will be back as an option. But both Guelph Public Library and Wellington Public Library have beginner birder kits and maker kits that feature binoculars, a decent pair of binoculars that you can test. Maybe that would be the kind of model that you'd want to get, or in that price range. May just give you a bit of insight into how binoculars work, whether you want to take the plunge. They're also going to come with some ID guide or ID material in these little kits. So they're a great option if you want to test the waters, or if you want to get your kids to, you know, have a go at birding, or if you're just noticing stuff in your backyard or at the Yorklands sites, and again, you don't know what it is, but you're not ready to commit to being a total bird nerd. Usually these library options are on 3-week loans, but again, things are up in the air right now. I'm not entirely sure of the situation. I'm pretty sure libraries are closed right now, but hopefully they'll reopen and this will once again be an option. But again, I'll just make mention of the Wild Birds Unlimited store. They're really helpful down there in Guelph in the South End on Courtright. And they'll actually take you out into the parking lot. Again, this might not be so easy to do right now, but typically they'd let you use a whole different bunch of binoculars to find the best fit for your needs. Yeah, they're really accommodating folks. So check it out. Tips for getting started. Okay, so you've got your gear, you've got your notebook, you've got your field guide, you've got your binoculars. What do? You're overwhelmed. There's birds everywhere and you don't know where to start. Well, don't worry, you're not going to get to know all the birds right away. There's going to be species that are unfamiliar. There's probably a whole bunch of species that you already know just from looking out your window, glancing at books, just even from like film and just being a human in this world. There's probably lots of stuff like blue jays, cardinals that you know about already. But there's going to be tons of other birds that are really mind-boggling, like all the sparrows, for example, all the streaky little brown things that look the same. But don't worry about it. It's going to make sense. The more time you spend with it, the more you get to know the common stuff, the more unusual birds will start to make sense. And discovering new ones along the way is a fun process. So yeah, start with your common backyard birds. Keep your eyes on the bird. I was guilty of this when I started, and a lot of people are. You get a glimpse at something, you get super excited, and straight away your head's down in the field guide and you're flicking through it. And yeah, before you know what's going on, yeah, the bird's gone and you've missed it. So it's definitely something to consider. Sorry, I was just checking the chat thing just to make sure everyone can hear me. Yeah, definitely something to think about. Don't get too distracted by your ID materials. Spend some time, maybe make some notes before plunging into the book or online. Don't forget to actually study that bird in the field. Use multiple ID clues. Don't just think that a species is something because it ticks one of the boxes in the book. You know, check out the range maps, check out the kind of habitat that they reside in. Use some clues on the face, on the wing, maybe use a vocalization as well. Don't just use one clue. And if you're struggling to get down to species, you know, just identify the bird to its family or to its group. There's still a lot of value in that. It's going to be a good part of the learning process. You're going to get a lot of. Don't get frustrated if you can't figure out what of the 30 different species of warbler it is that you're looking at. If you know it's a warbler, that's a great start. And learn your field guide. Spend some time with it at home in the evening. You know, figure out where the ducks are, where the hawks are, how to use those range maps, how to use the index, things like that. Don't just wait until you're in the field and then you're overwhelmed and you don't know your way around your field guide, because it's not going to help. So there's some little tips on how to get started. Oops. Okay, bird ID basics. What are you looking for? It can be, like I said, it can be pretty overwhelming. There's lots of features to look at. Often they're moving really fast, these little sparrows and warblers in particular, and it's hard to get a focus on them. So what can you make notes on mentally or physically? Quick things that you can look at that are going to help you with your identification. Color isn't always the most useful thing, and shape. Shape can be really useful. Sometimes there's very little light, and so color isn't even an option. So you're going to want to take note of the shape of the bird that you're seeing. What are the shape of the wingtips? Are they rounded? Are they straight? That can really help with raptors, with hawks. You've got different types of hawks that have shorter, rounder wings and longer, thinner tails. And then like the classic red-tailed hawk has kind of longer wings and a shorter, stouter tail. It all relates to their habitat, to their habits, to how they feed, how they fly. That kind of dictates that shape. But knowing those basic shapes will help you separate, okay, that hawk is in this group or this group. Or it's not even a hawk, it's a falcon if it has really sharp wingtips and a kind of longish, straight bottom tail. Shape of wingtips, shape of tail, length of tail is super important as well. Like this catbird here has a much longer tail than a blue jay. That's something you might notice. Or shape of swallowtails, for example, can be really useful. The posture of a bird, is it sitting upright? Is it more kind of cooped over? Things like that. Is it up on a fence post singing? These can be useful indications as well. And then bill size and shape can be really useful. So looking at the differences, this isn't the best example, but yeah, between say a sparrow or a finch, like checking out the bill, having a close look at that and realizing that it's dictated by what they eat again. So a sparrow has a short, sharp bill that can pick insects out of the ground, pick up little bits of seed, whereas a cardinal or a finch has a much more powerful bill that's actually used for breaking open seeds and nuts so that the bird can get its food that way. But also realize that a lot of these little things that we're looking at in terms of shape, it's all relative. So it may appear that a bird has a big bill, but you have to use some kind of measuring point for that. And this is the classic example of downy versus hairy woodpecker. You might see one in the field and you might think, okay, it's got a big bill, it's a hairy woodpecker. But the key thing to look at is like, how big is that bill relative to the head size? If you see both in the same tree, then you'll have a direct comparison, but that rarely happens. So you have to make some kind of mental note about, okay, what is the relative size of this feature compared to something else on the bird? So there's a few things to look at there in terms of shape, but size. We touched on this briefly just now, but compare a bird that you're seeing to the birds that you know. Compare a sparrow to, you know, like the finches, to the cardinals that you're most familiar with, or compare to a nearby object. If a bird's on a fence post, you can really kind of get a sense of how big that bird is, much better than if it's just up in the sky with like a pure blue background. There are a lot of people saying, oh, that's a big bird, but it's like, well, with nothing to compare for size, you really don't know how big it is. Everything's kind of relative. And so size can sometimes be hard to interpret, particularly from a distance, particularly through binoculars, particularly things that are soaring way up in the air. Excuse me a sec, I'm just going to take a sip of water here. I hope this is proving useful for people and everyone can hear me still. So a few seconds ago, I was saying that color is not always the most useful feature, but when it is, it's very helpful. So take note of the body. Is the main body itself streaky or is it solid in color? Often looking at the breast is particularly useful. Is it streaky? Is there a breast band? Is there a double breast band? In the case of killdeer, is there like a central breast spot like there is on a song sparrow? They can all be really useful clues. Check out the face as well. Like classic here, these sparrows, you can really identify a lot of the sparrows and warblers just from the face alone. And there's a lot of these awesome cartoons available on the internet now. This is from the American Birding Association, but there's some other groups that produce similar diagrams. There's some for warblers, and they're really useful. They really simplify things. You know, it's a pretty like, they're generous in their artistic nature, but they really do simplify things in terms of like, okay, this is the key thing that I want to look at for a field sparrow, for example. So stuff like that's pretty fun, pretty useful. Throat color, that can be a useful thing. Eye stripe is a key one to look at. This little stripe here, like kind of like a moustachial stripe, is known as the malar or cheek stripe. Again, learning your bird anatomy is really useful. Your field guides will pretty much all feature a section at the beginning where, I can't even find it in this one. Yeah, where they have, I'm just not sure if you're seeing this. Yeah, there we go. A bit of a diagram of the bird, and it will label all the main features. And so this is kind of key to familiarize yourself with ahead of time or as you're beginning, so that you know when you look up in the description of something later on, yeah, what is a malar stripe? If you're not kind of aware, or you don't know that basic anatomy, then the rest of the stuff in the field guide is going to be a bit harder and take a bit longer to get used to. So get to know your bird anatomy. That's a good trick. Yeah, the wings. What color are the wings? Do they have one ball color? Do they have like a wing stripe? Do they have a shoulder patch? Ducks have a lot of like colorful iridescent wing, not bars, but like, I forget what the word's called now, but like a big like blocky section of like iridescent blue. These are all great clues to help you figure out what that bird is. But also watch out for females. As you can see, this is a red-winged blackbird male, and the female, often confused for a sparrow. She's a little bit smaller. She's got that really sharp bill, but brown and streaky, but there's some subtle differences that will tell you that this is a blackbird. Like the stripe on the eye, the pink under the chin, and they do have a hint of red on the shoulder, particularly in the older females. But also watch out for seasonal variation, like those goldfinches that are really bright right now. They're going to be much duller in the winter, and they may throw you for a loop. And finally, yeah, bird ID basics, what to look for, context. Context is so useful. Those range maps in your field guide, they're really going to help. What kind of habitat is this bird in? What time of year? Certain birds you are only going to see in certain areas during migration or during the winter. Again, part of the joys of where we are here in the Great Lakes is that we not only get migrants passing through on the way to the boreal forest, coming all the way from the tropics, but we also get birds that spend the summer up in the Arctic coming here for the winter. Birds like juncos and shrikes and snow geese. So we really get to see throughout the year like a huge change in our bird populations, and it's super interesting. But yeah, time of the year, factoring in migration, they're going to help you figure out what those species are. So relate all that information to your field guide, to your app. And also behavior, particularly feeding behavior. It can be really a very useful way to separate out certain species. I'll just use the example of ducks in general. If you see a duck on the water and you see its butt up in the air and its head is submerged, you know you have a dabbling duck. There's basically two main groups of ducks, loosely divided into dabbling ducks and diving ducks. The dabbling ducks literally, yeah, they dabble. They tilt themselves up and they just forage on weeds and sometimes invertebrates just at the surface of the water. Whereas diving ducks, they're more the ones that you're going to find on the Great Lakes and in the seas, but they do wind up at like the Yorkland ponds during migration, and you'll see ducks there that are more diving. So behavior can be a really useful clue for identification. Okay, we're just gonna quickly now look through some key bird families that you're likely to encounter. This isn't an exhaustive list, and this isn't like the most scientifically accurate list. I've just tried to keep things real simple. There's definitely some groups I've missed off, but I tried to include the main ones that you're likely to encounter at the Yorkland site or in our urban natural areas here in Guelph, like along the 2Rivers, for example. And so what I've also done is try to include a picture of each, but a picture of a species that you're likely to encounter. But I also tried to include species which aren't on the list. So we put together, myself and some of the folks at the Yorklands, a species list. It's pretty simple, and again, it's not exhaustive by any means, but it's a great starting point. If you're out at the Yorklands, or again, just in your local area, some of the common species you're going to see. Maybe you've downloaded it already, or if not, we can send you the link and you can download it after. But that's going to give you, I think, 14 main species that you're going to see, but I've tried to include some extras in this, just to give you a sense of the diversity that we're dealing with here. So, ducks and geese as a starting point. Everyone kind of knows and is familiar with ducks and geese. We've got Canada geese here, but we've got several other types of geese that you may encounter during the season. Snow geese being one of the main ones. They've passed through now, but in early April, late March, there's the possibility of seeing them around. Not super common in this area, but it does happen. But the plethora of ducks that we get in the Great Lakes area is, I think, one of the true gems of birding, and particularly my first few winters in Canada, a lot of the ducks kept me sane. Not this species in particular, but a lot of those diving ducks that you would see on the Great Lakes, they're kind of the main diversity of birds that you get in the winter. So they're pretty exciting. There are definitely wood ducks at the Yorklands. I think there's quite a range of species of ducks that can be seen on those two big ponds, but particularly through the migration season, particularly April, September, maybe even late August and early, well, more September and October, I guess. But also loons and grebes. Earlier this year, there was a couple of weeks where there would be common loons cropping up pretty regularly on the Yorkland ponds, but also some grebes as well. And this little beauty is a horned grebe. Really quite a striking species when you see the details. These aren't my photos. These are all from All About Birds, the Cornell website. There are a couple of other grebe species that are less common. Pipe-bill grebe actually is fairly common and a good one to see. Again, earlier in migration. Just for context, right now we've just come to the end of May, and May is really like the peak of migration. So if you haven't got into birds in May, then there's still lots to see through the summer. But hopefully now you could kind of get familiar with a lot of your local breeding species through the summer and be ready for that fall migration. Fall migration is a bit slower. It's easier to enjoy it. Spring's a bit of a whirlwind, and before you know it, everything is just flooded through. And yeah, and it's over. It's over in the blink of an eye. It's a special time, May, but it goes by way too fast, and particularly this year it seemed to. But the fall migration is a bit more staggered, and you're able to enjoy it a bit more. I feel like I'm getting sidetracked here, but okay, diurnal raptors. We've got, again, quite a wide diversity. You've got your big buteo hawks, like this beautiful red-tailed hawk. Note the barring on the chest here. Not all individuals will have a red tail, particularly come the fall now. You might see some younger birds where it's just brown and streaky on the tail as well, but these shoulder marks, and just generally the facial markings, like these are the de facto hawk that you want to get familiar with. And again, it's getting familiar with the common species so that you see something
So when you see something different, you're like, okay, that's different. And then you really need to look at what that different bird is. But there's several buteo hawks that we get here during migration as well. Broad-winged, rough-legged during the winter. And then we have another group of hawks called the accipiters. We looked at them briefly on those silhouettes, but again, they're more the hot forest kind of hawks. So their wings are a bit shorter and their tails are longer, so they can zip in and out of the trees, so they can find their prey in and amongst the forest. So sharp-shinned hawk, Cooper's hawk are pretty common. And again, you may find them year-round at the site, at the Yorklands site. And also falcons. It's an interesting time to be a birder now, because a lot of the falcons seem to be doing pretty well these days. And we have species like Merlin and peregrine falcon that have somewhat relatively moved into our city here in Guelph. So keep your eyes peeled for them. They're stunning birds, and they're, I mean, I don't know if I can say this, but they're pretty badass as well. So they're always a joy to see. Merlins and peregrines, they are here in Guelph. Gulls and terns. Everyone's kind of familiar with gulls. I'm gonna try and get you to eliminate the word seagull from your vocabulary and just refer to them as gulls. But this is in fact a tern, and they're closely related. Terns have a bit more of a bill that is specialized for fishing. Often they have kind of a long tail that's used to help them in those kind of sweeping flights down to kind of find their prey in the water. And they have much kind of pointier wingtips than a gull would. But this is a Caspian tern. They're often known as carrot noses because this big orange bill is big. These are not small birds compared to some of the other species of terns that you can find. But this is kind of the most likely tern that you're going to see in and around Guelph. Pretty sure they breed at Guelph Lake, but they have been seen quite a bit recently at the Yorklands. Moving on here, we have another family group called the shorebirds. So a lot of these birds spend time in kind of muddy areas or flooded fields during migration. There's going to be one that you're really familiar with. It's killdeer. So they seem to just nest anywhere. I've seen them nesting on driveways, on building sites. It's a bit of a nightmare for that. They're not too what's the word, fussy on where they nest. But most shorebirds have really specific requirements. A lot of them breed way up north, kind of beyond where the tree line finishes, up in the Arctic. But there are definitely some that will be here through the summer. And this is the most common one, the spotted sandpiper. They're pretty cute, pretty charismatic little species. You can see them along the rivers here in the 2Rivers neighborhood, and you can see them at the Yorklands. Pretty small little guys, but they're super cute. Owls. We have a few different owl species in Wellington County. The most common is definitely the eastern screech owl. There are several pairs that nest in and around the city. And that's all I'm going to say on that. Sometimes owls have a tendency to attract big crowds. I mean, they're super cute, they're super beautiful. And sometimes we want to be a bit cautious with revealing where they are. Not everyone, I would say, is an ethical bird watcher or photographer. And, you know, there's definitely been cases of people getting a bit too close and not giving owls in particular as much space as they need. So that's something to be mindful of, but they're definitely around. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for them. I'm not going to say specifically at the Yorklands or anything. And in fact, I think they're more likely to be found in other areas in the city. But yeah, eastern screech owl is a good one to know. Woodpeckers, we've got a hairy woodpecker here, which we know because its bill is about the same length as its head. But that's one of, oh, I'm just doing some mental math now, about 5 or 6 woodpecker species that you can see in Wellington County throughout the year. Most of them, well, several of them sail wings along, downy, hairy. Some of the flickers do as well. We've got red-bellied is another one. And I'm blanking. Oh yeah, pileated woodpecker, of course, one of the biggest and most charismatic birds in our area. Beautiful, beautiful birds. And then finally hummingbirds as well, finally on this page. And so these little guys have just returned. They're around. Sometimes if you see or hear or even feel like a massive bumblebee close to your head or close to your feeder, take a closer look, because it might be a hummingbird. We really only have one species occurring in this area, the ruby-throated hummingbird. But if you see one lacking this ruby throat, it's probably a female, or if we're into August, September, it might be a juvenile. But if you happen to leave your bird feeder out till November and you get a hummingbird feeder, like, call me immediately, because it's probably a vagrant. It's probably not a ruby-throated. So a lot of people might get excited, but that doesn't happen. There's, you know, just a couple of Western species that maybe get blown out this way once or twice a year kind of thing, but it can happen. Moving on to some of the birds which are more, they're more closely related to each other. They're of the group, the songbirds, or the passiferaums. But within that group, we have quite a diverse array of species. And these species are all birds that are more vocal or have different vocal repertoire. So they're called songbirds because they sing. And those songs usually delineate the territory of the male. And so we'll start here with the flycatchers. This is probably the flycatcher that you may become most familiar with, particularly out of the Yorklands. I think they're pretty common there. It's an eastern kingbird. They're big, they're striking, they're vocal, they're pretty aggressive. You sometimes see them, you know, pursuing a hawk out of their territory, like a red-tailed hawk or something, or a crow. You know, for their size, they've got a lot of attitude. So they're pretty awesome birds. They actually have this cute little red patch in the head that's concealed most of the time, and they just flash it when they get really angry. We also have, probably very familiar to you, this group, the corvids. So the jays, the crows, and the ravens. Here we have blue jays. A little bit up north, we also have the Canada jay as well. But there are several other jay species throughout the continent. If you've been out west ever, you may have seen Stella's jay out there, or Clark's nutcracker. But here we pretty much just have blue jays. And they're often present year-round, but sometimes you will see big migrations of them in the spring and fall. And often those migrations, they don't occur every year. They're a bit of a funny species in that, you know, kind of what they're doing differs from year to year. But when they do migrate, you see them migrating during the day. Like a lot of songbirds migrate at night. And that's so that there's less chance of being predated, and there's less interference from the sun, from the solar, the solar effect of the sun. So a lot of these songbirds migrate at night, on a clear night, with winds in the right direction, little stars, little cloud, guiding themselves by the stars. But blue jays will tend to migrate at night. Blue jays and robins. So if you see like big flocks of them moving around during the day, they're migrating. And then the classic question that everyone wants to know is, what is the difference between a raven and a crow? Again, ravens, similar to the merlins, my understanding is like 10 years ago, they were not in Wellington County, but they're gradually moving south, possibly with climate change. And you are more likely now than ever to see a raven in this area. Elsewhere in Wellington County for sure, but even close to the city, it's a possibility. Pretty sure they're nesting out at the cliffs somewhere, like on the edge of town there. But what you're going to look for in terms of difference is size. But as we talked about earlier, if you don't have a comparison, if they're not side by side, size can be pretty tricky to gauge. So what you want to look at is tail shape. That's the most useful clue. If you've got a diamond tail shape, you have a raven. If it's kind of squared or fanned out, depending on what the bird's doing, whether it's soaring, whether it's flapping, it's more likely to be a crow. Also check out the head. The raven has a big, hunking, chunky bill, big fat neck, lots of like scruffy throat feathers as well, and these big kind of fingered primary flight feathers, kind of similar to a hawk. And they will glide around more like a hawk. You'll see them doing hawk-like behavior. So that's another clue that's going to help them stand out from a crow. A crow is going to have a much kind of shorter, stouter head, And then also the vocalizations. You're kind of familiar with the crow vocalization, but a raven has a much more hoarse, deep, croakier call. So that's another clue. Remember I said earlier about using more than one clue. Just moving on here, we also have a number of swallows in the area and at the Yorklands. This is a northern rough-winged swallow, so actually one of the more duller species of swallow. They're pretty kind of dusky brown on the chest underneath, and then just brown on the outside, on the back. I'm actually wondering if this is a female tree swallow on this picture, but I'm not sure. But yeah, we also have tree swallows, typically the males much more iridescent blue on the back. We also have barn swallows, which are the classic swallow that we all know from folklore with the big forked tail. And there's also cliff swallow as well, would be the other species that we're likely to see here. Purple martins are also in Ontario, southern Ontario, but they're not that common in around Guelph. I don't know any nesting colonies in Guelph itself. I think there's some elsewhere in Wellington County. They're not too easy to see around here. But yeah, we have a few different swallow species for sure. And then if you have your checklist handy, black-capped chickadee and white-breasted nuthatch are on there, but we also have these guys, the red-breasted nuthatch. So the nuthatches and the chickadees, they're all pretty closely related, and they have similar feeding habitats. They're pretty sociable birds, particularly the chickadees. So they're definitely things that you are likely to see at the Yorklands or at your feeder in your backyard. And then the thrushes. I mean, we're all familiar with the American robin. Again, it's on your Yorklands checklist if you have it handy. But I dare say most of you are less familiar with some of the other thrush species that we have. A lot of them just pass through here on migration. But I believe that some will stick and breed in some of the more heavily wooded areas on the edge of the city, perhaps. This one is a Swainson's thrush. Notice kind of the buffy spectacles on the face and these like breast spots here. But the thrushes can be pretty hard to identify. There's like 4 different species that we could get here on migration. Hermit, Swainson, gray-cheeked. Oh, and wood thrush. And wood thrush will stick around and breed as well, but they are in decline. But they do have the most beautiful song of all those thrushes. So they're ones to keep your ears open for and familiarize yourself with. But generally, yeah, all the thrushes have very similar habits. They're going to be rooting around on the ground, picking up worms and other insects, other invertebrates, insects, that kind of thing. They've got quite long tails, quite upright posture. So again, very familiar from our robin friends. And then moving on to the last slide here for the key bird families. And again, this isn't exhaustive. There are other ones that I've missed, but these are the most likely ones that you're going to encounter at the Yorkland sites, along our urban rivers and in your backyard. I'll start at the bottom here. The finches, cardinals, and grosbeaks. We all know the northern cardinal, very familiar friend in our backyard. And we all know American goldfinch as well, also on the Yorklands checklist that you may have in front of you. And rose-breasted grosbeak as well. But also in this little mishmash family of birds is the indigo bunting. So much smaller than the others, similar superficially in terms of like bill structure maybe to like the finches, but more closely related to the cardinals, if anything. But beautiful, beautiful colors. They definitely breed on and around the Yorklands. Great bird to be out for in the summer. Moving upwards here, we have the icterids, or the blackbirds. So that includes the red-winged blackbird that we looked at earlier, the common grackle. Rusty and brewer's blackbird are 2 less common ones that you may get on migration. And then the Baltimore Oriole might be one of the more well-known birds in this family. They're on your Yorklands checklist. They breed at the Yorklands. They are stunning, stunning, beautiful birds. Mid-migration, so like mid-May, you know, they're not here and then suddenly they're here and they're singing and you really know about it. And then pretty much the moment they wrap up their breeding, they disappear. And it's pretty hard to see an oriole come, well, mid-August around here. They're pretty much all gone. And then one other species, well, there's a couple of other species that are less likely to be seen perhaps, in this group, the bobolink and the meadowlark. They are kind of meadow specialists. They like a lot of farmland that's been, that isn't monoculture crop, that isn't kind of got pesticides all over it. They like good quality natural hay meadow, which we have much less of now in southern Ontario than we did 50 years ago. So they are species of decline and concern. But yeah, the meadowlark has definitely been seen out of the Yorklands. They possibly breed there, and they are pretty stunning, beautiful birds with a beautiful song. So check them out. Yeah, the sparrows. These are every new birder's nightmare. They all look brown. They all look streaky. I used to think they were really boring, but once you get into them, they are stunning. They're cute. They're really curious little cute creatures. We have, like, off the top of my head, I would say at least 15 species that we could get here throughout the year, possibly more. So nice diversity, and a lot of them are quite a bit more interesting looking than this song sparrow. But I've included the song sparrow because it's not on your Yorklands list, and because it is really the most likely sparrow species that you are likely to encounter at the Yorklands or in the city. Note the brown streaks, the kind of uniform brownness of all these streaks, the central dark spots, the thick chunky bill, kind of blockish chunky head as well, and then this kind of gray cheek, these white throat patches, and the molar stripe going through there. Just your textbook classic sparrow. But also be aware that most of the sparrows that you're likely to see in urban centers are probably house sparrows. And so they're actually in a different family entirely to our North American sparrows, because they are originally a European species. Similar to the European starling, they were brought over here, introduced into New York in the late 1800s, and they have just become prolific. They've expanded throughout the country, throughout the continent, and to the point of being invasive or considered potentially invasive. So that's house sparrows. They're not on this slide, but they're one to familiarize yourself with, because you're going to see them a lot, and you don't want to confuse them with the interesting native sparrows. But, they're present, and they are pretty interesting in their own way. And then finally, working backwards a little bit on this slide, the wood warblers. And I got two species here. There's another one on your Yorklands checklist, the yellow warbler, which is the most common breeding warbler in southern Ontario. This guy as well, the common yellowthroat, is also very common. Notice the black mask, which is lacking in the female. The females are quite difficult to identify. They don't have as much yellow on the throat. But these are the ones that do that kind of familiar song. You're going to find them in wet areas, by the wet meadow and the marsh at the Yorklands. You might even hear them along the river, in the 2Rivers neighborhood. Certainly yellow warblers down there as well. Those two warblers that I mentioned are one or two of up to 30 species that we could have passing through this area during migration. So if you're just waking up to the joys of warblers, I'm a little bit sad that it's May 31st for you, because a lot of them have moved through now. But 2 weeks ago, here in town, there were warblers everywhere. Every little patch of forest or along the river where there's like dense trees, if you spent some time and energy concentrating, you would find maybe this guy, the Blackburnian warbler, one of my favorites. This doesn't really do justice to how bright the chest is on these guys. If you imagine, you know how bright a Baltimore Oriole is, but you compress all that orangeness into just the chest of a bird that's this big, and you have your Blackburnian warbler. I mean, they are just stunning. But again, there's so many different warbler species that you can see in this area during migration. And again, it's kind of counting our blessings of being here in the lower Great Lakes that we get this opportunity. I mean, these tiny little birds are flying 4,000-5,000 kilometers in the space of a month just to get to their breeding grounds. I mean, it's staggering. Well, okay, maybe 2 months. So I think that covers most of the bird families that you're likely to encounter. I just wanted to briefly, before we make some time for questions here, go through a couple of online resources that may be useful to you beyond the apps that we looked at earlier. And these could be sent out in an email if folks don't get to write them down right now. Birds Canada, formerly Bird Studies Canada, fantastic organization, really the big bird conservation and education organization in the country. They do a lot of work engaging folks in, you know, how to get to know the wildlife in your backyard. They do a lot of work with that. They also do a lot of work on species at risk. They also coordinate quite a few citizen science programs like Swift Watch and the Marsh Migration Monitoring Program, Feeder Watch, Christmas Bird Count, all these great citizen science programs that you can be a part of, that you can contribute to. So check out their website. In particular, this top link can be found within this section, the Roost. It's a great little thing where you punch in your location and it comes up with a photo checklist, similar to the Yorklands checklist, but it'll be a bit more comprehensive. So again, if you don't want to take the plunge or you're unsure about buying an ID guide or an app, this is a good starting point for you. Check out some of the other links on the Roost. There's some great family activities there. There's some workbooks for kids. There's some tips on making your own bird feeders. There's lots of bits on there. This was set up actually because a lot of birders, serious birders, weren't able to go to places like Peely this May. So a lot of birders have been restricted to their own neighborhoods or their own backyards. So this was set up to encourage that kind of birding. And so there's a lot of mentions about, okay, how can we, you know, where to find birds in your neighborhood, that kind of thing. That's worth checking out. The Audubon page is great, and this part of it especially is a very comprehensive field guide featuring illustrations from Sibley that we mentioned earlier, the field guide, and lots of photos. There's great descriptions, lots of information. It's a great online resource, but it's not the kind of thing you could take out to the field. But great to look at on the computer at home, great for kids to check out as well. All About Birds. This is the website brought to you by the Cornell Lab down in New York State. Again, really fantastic resource, particularly when you're starting out. You can punch in various species and it'll give you lots of information. Yeah, there's a bird guide, there's seminars and other things about bird ID skills. There's information on how to feed the birds, how to set up bird feeders, how to stop squirrels from pilfering from them. Yeah, how to make bird-friendly homes. So that might be to do with like native plant gardens, or it might be building bird boxes. I'm not entirely sure. There's sounds, there's songs, there's competitions, there's live webcams that go to like owl feeder boxes, there's courses, there's all kinds of cool stuff. Awesome website, check it out. And it's All About Birds, or sorry, it's the Cornell Lab that brings us the Merlin Bird ID Guide, which is fantastic, a great starting point for anyone new to birds. So check that out. And then finally, eBird. Probably not something that you want to get into straight away if you're just starting out, but you might. It's a great way to collect your observations. Any checklist that you make, any list of birds that you see, say if I'm sat in my yard here for an hour, I can make a list of every species, every individual I see, like 3 goldfinch, 2 robins. Or if I go for like a 5-hour hike along the river, I can say I hiked this distance over this much time, this much effort, and you put that checklist into eBird, either on the website or through an app that you can download. And it's going to keep all those observations for you in checklists, so you can look back at them. It's going to keep a record of how many species you've seen, both in the country, in the province, in your county, even in your local hotspot. You can add your yard on there. It'll tell you, yeah, how many lists you've made. You can add photos, you can add sounds, you can access other people's photos, other people's sounds. You can search species. You can even search your area, and it'll tell you the best places to go birding in your area. So super useful tool, super useful website. But if you are contributing to this, you're also contributing to the biggest citizen science program on the planet. They've had millions of checklists submitted, and this data is being used by actual scientists to inform conservation decisions on like international levels. So it's a great thing to be a part of. Don't think just because you're a beginner that you can't contribute. Kind of what I was alluding to earlier, like a lot of birders will spend a lot of time at these migration hotspots like Peely and Long Point. And so eBird just gets inundated with those lists. And there's only so much data you can get from that. There's going to be a lot more use in you contributing sightings from your yard or your local hotspot, if it's the Yorklands or the river here or whatever, on a regular basis all the way through the season. Like much better data is going to come through that than people going and doing a big day at Point Peely. So you can definitely contribute to this citizen science in a meaningful way. And also it's a great tool. Like it's really going to help you keep track of your species, and that's a great way to further your education, to further your learning experience. And again, you don't have to do this. Birding, I think the joy of birding, just kind of as a bit of a summary here, is not, you could take it to any level, really. You can keep it really casual. It can just be something that you do very passively, or you can go all out and do big days, big years, that kind of stuff. Keep a life list. You really choose your own level of involvement. And as one of my mentors said earlier, or that quote that I put up earlier, it's not just an activity, it is a state of mind. So I hope that has all been useful to you. There's some other references here where I got my photos from for this. And yeah, I think we're going to open it up to some questions now. So maybe I'll pass it back to Beth. And we'll go from there.
Okay. Hi, everyone. First, I'd like to thank you very, very much, Matthew. That was very interesting, and it's just great to have such a knowledgeable expert here in Guelph to give us all this information. And also, I found it very interesting to hear that there were so many of these birds at Yorklands Green Hub. So just thank you so much. It was great. Now, do we have any questions? Can you see this one, Matthew? How far we should go with birding if we will work in restoration ecology?
Okay. I'm not entirely sure how to interpret that question. I don't know if this person, Milad, could offer up something a bit more specific. Otherwise, I could just say that I am very much into and interested in restoration ecology as well myself. It was part of my academic studies. Definitely,
Maybe I could unmute her and she could. Oh, here we've got several. Sorry.
How we should go with birding. I would say you can go as far as you want with birding. Like I was saying before, you know, it can be a very casual thing. Should we learn about sounds and habitat? That's a good question. I think the more that you can learn of vocalizations, it's going to help you identify birds in the field a lot better. There's only so many birds that you can see visually. They move around. They're not always the most cooperative. Sometimes the light's kind of crappy. Sometimes they're just too high up, or there's too many leaves in the trees. So the more that you can learn in terms of sounds, calls, and song in particular, it's just going to heighten your experience and improve your ability. Again, it's not essential, and it's not the easiest thing. Like I very much struggled earlier on with bird sounds, and it took me a long time to really make progress with that. A lot of people will potentially download or purchase a collection of bird songs. There's CDs that you can buy or MP3s. Some you can download for free, and they will just sit and listen to them all before going out in the field. And I could never do that. Like, it just wouldn't stick. So for me, I found the most the most productive way of learning vocalizations was to find a bird in the field that I was unfamiliar with, see it, and then see it sing. And then once I saw it make that noise, then it stuck a lot more. But the trouble, and I'll just kind of keep this brief, the trouble with song and calls, more so song, is that it's such a short window that a lot of these birds are singing each year. It's really just, well, some species, April, but mostly May, June, July, and then they stop. So it's a very small window that they're actually being super vocal. So it's a very narrow window to learn. So maybe you want to spend the other 8 months of the year listening to the recordings in preparation. I don't know. I can't do that personally, but and then habitat. Yeah, the more you can learn about your habitat, or just getting familiar with certain types of habitat, being aware of the kind of species that are unique to that habitat. Like if you're going to go and spend some time at Luther Marsh in northern Wellington County, or even certain areas of the Yorklands around the marshy area, then you're going to see different birds to the ones you might see along the river here. So I think over time you'll be able to make those connections. But yeah, doing a bit of research in your field guides will definitely assist with that. And I'm just reading some of the other comments and questions here. Yeah, that's interesting. Someone's saying about the similarities and differences between South Africa. Yeah, I came from Europe and there was some similarities, but then I spent time in South America, and so a lot of birds were very familiar to me here. Okay, a question from Nora. Hi, Nora. Do all birds have songs and calls? Pretty much just the songbirds will have those like male territorial songs. And so with a lot of those birds, like the males, they get pretty aggressive. They want to defend their territory, but they want to avoid conflict as well. They're pretty small, pretty vulnerable. Their skin's very thin. Like they can't take physical conflict, so they sing to avoid that. I mean, I feel like as humans, we could learn a lot from that. But yeah, by setting out their territory, they manage to avoid physical conflict. And so it's just the males that are doing those songs, but there is a huge plethora of other vocalizations that both songbirds and non-songbirds are making. So whether that's contact calls between a male and a female, you might hear it with the cardinals in your backyard, or whether it's, yeah, ducks quacking to each other in flight or on the water. What it is all birds, they don't want to be on their own. Well, there's certain species that are pretty solitary, but a lot of birds are pretty gregarious, and so they like to be around other birds. It provides safety. It provides, it lets them know where food is. So by being in constant contact through vocalizations, that's going to help them do that. But long story short, yeah, like hawks, ducks, shorebirds, they have vocalizations, but they don't really have songs in the same way that a cardinal or a blackbird or a warbler does. So hopefully that is helpful. Someone here is asking for the link to the Yorklands birding list. I don't know if we can provide that right here, or yeah, that's something we'll maybe send in a follow-up email, unless we could figure it out now, Beth. I don't know.
If you have it, you can just post it in the chat box. If you have the link handy, or we can email it out later.
Yeah, I'm not sure I do have it handy. I'll have a little look. I did see it appear on, I think, the Facebook event earlier, so that might be worth checking out in the meantime. But if not, it will be available for download, or we'll send out an email to everyone who's here with some of those links and that. Okay, Nora says it will be on our website shortly. What is my background? It's the Grand Canyon, but I'm not actually at the Grand Canyon. It's just my background. Okay. Another question here. Have you heard anything on the piping plover populations this year? I know they are back in Sauble Beach. Hopefully the restricted access to the beach will give them some much needed space, but volunteer efforts have been restricted. Yeah, very interesting question. I've not heard much about them this year. I did see something that a friend in the birding community posted online, that the town of Sauble Beach had put in a request or a application to groom the beach, which is really short-sighted of the municipality to even like try that. They seem to think that it's necessary in preserving the beach for human activity, but it can really damage viable piping plover habitat. So it's pretty contentious. I'm pretty sure they did it a year or two ago without a permit and they got busted. But like, unfortunately, I think the fine for something like that for a municipality might be fairly, you know, just a drop in the water for them. So I mean, I hope those piping plovers, and I hope a lot of birds really, like with the decrease in human activity due to the pandemic, are kind of appreciating the benefits of that. So unfortunately, Ames, I can't give you much more of an answer than that, but it's something that I'd be curious to look into as well. We got a question from Carolyn down here. What is the best place to access the Yorklands?
I could unmute Nora if you'd like, and she could answer that question.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. I'm trying to unmute her here. There we go. Okay.
Yes. The best place for the entrance would be on York Road, and unfortunately, you have to be careful where you park along there and walk carefully up to the entrance at 785 York Road, across from the little tiny plaza, the Publix Variety, for example. The gates are closed, and a lot of people think there's no access there, but there is. It's just not access for vehicles. So that's the best place to go in. That you can also go up to the next bus stop, which would be at the Trampoline Center at the corner of Watson Parkway and York Road. And you could park in there. If there seems to be lots of room because of course it's not being used at the moment. And you can walk in the northern part of or the eastern, I guess, part of the Blue Dot Trail. There is access right now. As the season goes on, the weeds get very high in there. And if you're going to enter the Blue Dot Trail from that point, it's hard to sometimes see where it is because it gets closed in with weeds. But best place would be at 785 York Road.
Thanks, Nora.
And they just walk through.
Oh, excellent. It looks like Amy just posted the checklist on this chat box as well. So thanks for doing that, Amy. Should be available there for everyone to download. Was there any other burning questions that anyone had about the Yorklands or about birds in general? Well, I guess the silence is a good sign. Maybe everyone's looking out their windows and at their feeders already.
Well, thank you very, very much, Matthew. This has been very interesting indeed, and I hope everybody will take the chance to go out to Yorklands and other places around Guelph and check out the birds. Thanks everyone for coming. Take care. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, take care. May the birds be with you.